There was a time, once and long ago, when the night did not only carry the sound of distant engines and the echo of gunfire. There was a time when the dark between the stars was a garden, slow, patient, and vast, where shapes moved with intention and thought, and the universe itself felt like a careful thing. Close your eyes. Imagine that silence like a warm blanket that is both heavy and gentle. In that silence lived the old ones. They were not gods in the way the later races came to call gods. No blazing thrones, no thunder of impossible mandates. Think instead of craftsmen at a great and patient loom. Think of beings who shape the patterns of life as one might shape a river with careful hands, bending, guiding, letting flow. Their cities were threads stretching across the dark. Their tools were geometry and song. Their delight was in form, in the architecture of living things. They carved pathways through reality that shimmered like glass corridors of possibility where travel and thought folded together. In those corridors, they tended to the web of life, coaxing new shapes into being and teaching them, as a gardener teaches saplings to reach. Their faces, if we must speak of faces, kept secrets. They wore no sorrow in public. Their features, when glimpsed, were like etchings in moonlight, serene, composed, unhurried. They walked with the easy certainty of beings who had learned the patience of eons. When they spoke, their voices were low and measured, a sound like water running over old stones. They had language for precision, phrases that could shape growth as easily as a potter shapes clay. When they touched a seed of life, it woke into form with gratitude. The places the old ones built were not merely cities or planets. They were living things, spires of crystal that sang when wind moved through them, gardens whose leaves recorded conversations in the way tree rings remember seasons, and halls where the ground itself remembered the footsteps of those who had walked before. Webways, strange, luminous arteries that cut through the dark like veins of light, connected distant shores of the galaxy. Through them, the old ones moved swiftly, patient and careful, like tides that remembered the shorelines from the earliest dawn. The webway hummed with a sound like a lullaby. It made the heart slow. And yet within this calm, not all was untroubled. Even in gardens there are thorns. When you lie with your back to the world and watch the slow turning of the sky, listen closely. Beneath the soft music of wind and leaves you may hear a thread pulled tight, a hush that catches on old stones. That hush is important to the story. It is where the first seeds of shadow began to stir. It helps perhaps to meet the faces who will walk with us through these early hours. Names are thin things to pin down a being of such age, but names give us anchors, so we will borrow a few, gentle sounds that will sit easily by your ear as we drift. There is Elori of the Loom, an old one whose hands were known to coax patterns of light into laws of life. There is Valeth, who would, in many ages hence, be whispered about as the first of the soft races, an inheritor of the old one's patience. There is Coran of the Duskborn, whose skin was like sun-baked bone, and who watched the stars with a hunger in his eyes. And farther still, before names, there was a humming, an intelligence of the stars that ate like frost, a presence like a bright cold and slow, which later tongues would call things that shook the galaxy. Elori loved structure. She loved the way in which a melody could be folded into flesh and make that flesh remember how to move like a river. She walked through her halls at a measured pace, the echo of her step recorded in the crystalline cathedrals where the old ones kept their archives. She carried instruments, rods that shivered faintly with pure geometry, brushes that coaxed cellular forms into new harmonies. When she sang, oh, there were notes that could make dormant genes bloom. Her voice braided with the webway and left behind trails of soft light that scented the air like rain on stone. People later would tell tales of the sweetness of the old one's music. The elders of other races would whisper that listening to it was like falling into sleep and waking with something new in your hand. Valeth, by contrast, moved as one learns to move in a long, quiet orchard. He was patient with the young, those nascent minds who looked to the stars with wide, hungry curiosity. Valeth tended the first of the lilting minds, placing them like seedlings into the soil of the world and watching them open. He taught them to think beyond their bodies. His touch was soft and almost hesitant, as though he feared that haste might bruise the fragile bloom of life. The creatures he raised took to the music, shapes of slender grace and bright thought that would later wander the dream paths between worlds, learning to weave their own songs from what he had given. Coran of the Duskborn was a watcher. He bore scars not of battle but of long thinking, a skin creased by sun and time. Where Elori and Valith saw possibility, Coran saw balance and consequence. His gaze lingered on the edges of things. He noticed in the quiet hours when the webway slumbered like a sleeping animal that some presences tasted of grief. He saw stars whose light had a tremor, and in the tremor he read a history of hurt. He had empathy wrapped in a hardness, a compassion that wore a shield. He asked questions that other old ones preferred to leave as gentle suggestions, and he worried, softly, at first, about what might come to pass when creation became too clever for kindness. And the humming, call it a star sense or an old god's whisper or the first cold of a winter to come, moved like a slow tide. It was not audible in the way music is audible. One did not listen with ears. One felt it in the spaces between thoughts, a chill in the webway, a drawn breath of nothing. The old ones, being careful, noticed. They cataloged that silence as one would catalog a strange herb. They named it with a notation and folded it into their libraries. In that act of naming and filing it away, however, they turned it from a passing cold into a story with edges, and stories find ears. The old one's work was the work of a species who believed that complexity made the universe kinder. They dispensed thought like seed, a melody here, a line of code there, a gene in the soil. When they left traces of themselves, devices carved with symbols, gardens that encoded directions, and patience taught to remember, these were gifts. The new races took to these gifts with the fervor of children finding a new language. The Eldar, graceful and silver-eyed, learned to dance with the songs of the webway. They named stars as one might name companions. The Krork, no, these earliest brutish things were not yet the joyous brutes they would become. They were first large and raw with potential, a lumbering strength the old ones thought to harness for toil and shape. The first-minded creatures learned to remember history. They learned to carry tailies in their blood. There was wonder in that era. Planets were playgrounds of experiment. Life blossomed in forms that drifted along under the old one's gentle calibration. Entire systems hummed with peaceful industry, machines that fed rivers, architectures that encouraged certain winds to blow, and songs that taught young minds to dream of stars. The webway allowed beings to walk from one world to another as if taking a path through a garden, and the old ones maintained its corridors with tender vigilance. It is easy, from the vantage of later chaos and ruin, to look back and romanticize, but the old ones were not perfect. They were beings of thought who sometimes trusted in thought alone. They made decisions by the measure of beauty and balance, and sometimes what is beautiful to a long-lived mind is unsuited to the one who will live only a few decades. There were experiments that produced marvels, and experiments that produced unanticipated pain. The old ones, patient, careful, kept both in their archives like two sides of the same coin. When we speak softly of the old ones, we must let a small unease sit at the edge of our comfort. Like the hush in a house when a child has left a toy in the stairwell, that unease is a small thing at first. It is a thing you might notice only if you are awake very late and the light is low. The first hints of imbalance came not with a thunder but with a fraying, a webway corridor that sang a note out of tune, a creature whose song cracked at the edges, a garden where flowers refused to open. These were not alarms. Rather, they were corrections waiting to be made. It was Coran who first suggested a different kind of listening. He walked under the lattice of a freshly woven webway and cocked his head, as one might tilt a cup to see if any scent had lingered. He said, quietly, that something at the periphery of the galaxy was changing, that there were minds knitting a different pattern, the outline of a hunger. The old ones discussed this with the methodical calm of those who have cataloged every leaf of the garden. They did not panic. They were not naive. They simply believed safely, perhaps too safely, that knowledge and gentleness could ward off the worst. Elori answered him with a soft, almost musical objection. "We are not the keepers of all sorrow," she said in a tone of one who waters flowers and does not wish them to hear harsh words. "We have given forms to guide themselves. They will do what forms do. We will mend what frays." Valith, tending a small cluster of newborn minds, hummed and said only, "Care first." His voice contained the warmth of sun on leaves. "Teach the young. Do not try to bind the whole cosmos to one law." So they worked. They sent lessons that bent back the edges of strangeness. They asked their creations to remember restraint. They offered more music, more gardens, and more delicate structures. The webway sang again. Life resumed its easy arc. And yet, the dark that had been noticed continued to move like a slow thing beneath the waves. It found ways to grow where attention dwindled. Where the old ones were not present, on a remote moon, in a quiet nebula, at the edge of a webway corridor, there was room for other minds to whisper and conspire. The first bitter minds that would later become something else watched and took note, folding the old ones' gifts into their own hunger. They began to craft, in secret and shadow, remedies for their own old pains, bright, awful methods that the old ones did not foresee, or if they did foresee, chose to contain with soft words rather than harsh locks. This is the hum that runs at the edges of our story. It is like the memory of an old cold that will not quite leave your bones. For now, in this first chapter, the galaxy is wide and mild. The old ones move through it as careful gardeners move through a vast arboretum. They name stars and teach saplings to sing. They keep watch in the webway. They are patient, beautiful, and slow. Yet as you lie here, drifting with the voice, notice a small change in the air, no louder than a breath and no brighter than a candle guttering. There is an awareness that the webway remembers everything, and what is remembered can be turned. Names are seeds and stories take root. The old ones plant 1,000 stories. A handful of those tailies will grow into thorns. For now, sleep as if under their care. Imagine Elori's soft hands weaving light into the shape of a lullaby. Hear Valith hum an instruction like rain on leaves. Feel Corin's steady gaze at the rim of your dream, wary but not yet alarmed. Let the slow music of the webway carry you deeper, and let your mind walk with them just a little further into the dark. There, where the stars seem to keep their own counsel, you will meet the first echoes that will one day become thunder. But for this hour, the echoes are only whispers, and whispers in their way are still beautiful. Close your eyes now. Imagine a spire of glass and star mist, a path lit in clear, steady strands. The old ones walk it, and the webway sings. The early worlds tilt gently in sleep. Remember that in this hush is both tenderness and the seed of what will come. Breathe slowly. Keep the quiet close. Under the hands of the gardeners, the galaxy still feels like a cradle. The story will go on from here, but for now, let the cradle rock you. Let the hush keep you. Let the old one's lullaby ease you toward sleep. And if sleep should carry you a moment further than you mean, do not be surprised to feel an old cold whispering at the edges of your dream. It is only the first thread being pulled. It is only the beginning. In the soft hours before dawn, when a single star can feel like a deliberate thought, there are beginnings that move with a different tempo. The old ones belong to such a tempo. They were not born in haste, nor did they make decisions on impulse. Their age taught them a rhythm measured in tectonic shifts of awareness, rather than in the quick flutters of mortal hearts. To understand them is to learn to listen to those slow beats, the steady folding of thought into form, the patient tasting of consequence before action, the willingness to let an idea cool and set like metal in a mold. They practice creation as a craft. The old ones conceived life as one might compose a long, intricate song. Motifs braided into motifs, variations laid carefully over time, and harmonies tested until the ear, trained and exacting, could not find fault. Their aim, when they began, was not dominion. They sought a balance of kinds, intelligences that could think in different cadences, bodies adapted to varied suns, minds tuned to different weather of feeling. They wanted a galaxy that could talk to itself in many languages, so that the webway, their ribbon of travel and thought, would be a chorus rather than a single voice. This desire did not come from arrogance. It came from a belief that variety might be the best insurance against the slow attrition of loneliness. To them, to seed the galaxy with many minds was to give the universe the companionship of dialogue. That belief shaped their methods, careful, iterative, and full of restraint. When the old ones worked on a living thing, they did so in ways that were both scientific and almost ritualistic. They measured, they recorded, they retested. Their laboratories were not clinical in the harsh modern sense. They were places of devotion where microscopes shared space with altars of quiet contemplation. Instruments hummed with the frequency of thought, and living tissue lay on beds that breathed in time with the webway's slow music. Their philosophy held that creation itself was a conversation. They believed that species should be given the tools to speak back, instincts that hinted at culture, capacities for memory, and, most importantly, an opening for evolution that would be guided but not fixed. Their works often began with a question rather than an answer. What might this new mind dream of? How might a body dance under a violet sun? Which patterns of gene and song would produce curiosity rather than submission? This conversational ethic made them generous with autonomy. They crafted prompts in genomes and nodes in the webway that encouraged self-direction. They built learning architectures, biological frameworks that taught infants how to listen, how to parse patterns, how to invent. To the old ones, giving a species the ability to tell its own story was the highest kindness they could offer. Yet there was another strand woven through their thinking, a quiet, clinical desire to limit suffering. Because they themselves were ancient witnesses to long cycles of deterioration, many of their projects included fail-safes, checks against runaway growth, safeguards against pathogens, and even behavioral dampeners to curb tendencies the old ones judged likely to lead to suffering. These restraints were framed as compassion, but compassion with a mathematician's hand can be cold. Where the old ones judged that a trait would lead to violence or despair, they sometimes trimmed it back, and in doing so they made choices that would later feel like constraints to the living beings on which those choices were made. This moral calculus, compassion measured by the old one's own slow clock, would be central to the tragedy that followed. For in the act of shaping others to avoid future pain, the old ones sometimes preempted the full emergence of what it is to be a self. The seeds they planted often came braided with a tether, a line of code in a genome, a lullaby in the webway, a ceremonial pattern etched into skull and stone. To those who received the gifts, such tethers could feel like dinner threaded with a hidden string. When we speak of their methods, imagine a laboratory that is also a conservatory and a cathedral. Their tools combined genetics, psychic tuning, and spatial engineering in a single practice. They did not merely alter DNA with blunt instruments. They sang instructions into embryonic strands. They wove psychic scaffolds around growing minds so that certain patterns of thought would be nurtured. They grafted micro-webway nodes into nervous systems so that some individuals would be able, almost as naturally as breathing, to step into the wider network of travel and memory. Their genetic work was intricate. Rather than injections and edits alone, the old ones used bioluminal arrays, delicate, lattice-like machines that brushed a developing embryo with calculated rhythms of light and sound. Those rhythms acted as templates. Cells, sensitive to pattern, grew into those templates and formed structures that read like a poem in living tissue. The old ones mapped not only protein sequences, but also the harmonic architecture of experience. Which pulse of light might predispose a mind toward curiosity? Which sequence of ambient sound might favor cooperative behaviors? Their records contain entries that read like parables. Tend the ear, and the mind will sing. teach a hand to make, and the heart will learn to hold. In psychic engineering, an art the old ones practiced with solemnity, they created nodes of resonance that could be embedded in a culture's youth. These nodes were not post hoc manipulations. They were more like education programs in the form of persistent psychic impressions. Imagine a lullaby that, when heard as an infant, imprints a softness of thought that later becomes a cultural habit. The old ones used such methods to encourage empathy, restraint, and long-range thinking. These psychic nodes were subtle, woven into the rites of early societies as stories and songs, so that the guidance felt like heritage rather than authored intervention. Spatial design, the webway, was perhaps their most splendid achievement. Where travel takes effort for most creatures, shipbuilding, fuel, fare, the webway allowed beings to step between worlds as if through doorways in a garden hedge. It was both a road and a living library, a place where histories layered and echoes persisted. The webway's corridors were tuned to certain harmonics. They resonated differently depending on the minds that walked them. The old ones maintained these harmonics with endless care, pruning paths and retuning nodes to make the network safe for fragile minds. For them, the webway was a social fabric as much as an infrastructure. The routes of travel were routes of memory, argument, and reconciliation. Their creations varied in scale and temperament. Each species they shaped reflected an aspect of their intent: beauty, function, resilience, but also bore traces of the old ones themselves in its architectures and cultural hooks. The Eldar, for instance, came of their hands as beings of luminous grace and psychic talent, crafted to be sensitive to the webway's music and to remember their own histories like long songs. The earliest Krork, strong, rapid-growing shapes, were given vigor and appetite, the old ones hoping to channel force into creation rather than destruction. Humans, too, were observers of old ones' touch in those distant eras. The seeds of our adaptability, our plasticity, were admired and carefully fed. But gifts can be misread or misused. Where the old ones intended memory to be a heritage, some cultures made of it an obsession. Where they meant psychic sensitivity to be a shared tool, some populations weaponized it. Where they aimed to create strength for building worlds, some found ways to make strength into conquest. When a species' culture, environment, or needs skewed in unforeseen ways, the old ones' designs could bend into menace. Consider for a moment the Eldar. Beautiful, long-lived, exquisitely tuned to the webway, they thrived as dreamers and artisans. But their very refinement made them prone to certain extremes. Sensitivity can unbalance. Depth of feeling can calcify into self-absorption. The old ones had not intended for such outcomes as a singular culture's decadence. Yet the seeds of intensity planted in their minds could feed a spiral toward consumption rather than creation. The Eldar's later tragedies, beyond our present scope, were seated in strands the old ones placed for what they thought would be greatness. The Krork story is of another kind. Where the old ones hoped raw force could be harnessed for construction, the Krork's appetite for action and combat sometimes outpaced any civilizing input. Strong bodies and straightforward minds met little resistance in certain environments, and those forms learned to fight as a habit rather than as a necessity. In later ages, when their descendants became the orcs, that fight became near religious. The old ones had given them force. They had not imagined the force would find joy in its own practice of destruction. Most tragic, perhaps, is the tale that bridges to the Necronter and the Citan. The old ones' archives record efforts to temper the bitterness of the Necronter, beings who were themselves twisted by grief and short life, by offering technologies and knowledge that might soften mortality. But where empathy meets despair, complex grief can become a vector for darker transformations. The Necronter made bargains that the old ones could not foresee, bargains that traded flesh for immortality and autonomy for skeletal eternity. The old ones' interventions, intended, again, as repair, became a mirror in which even their kindness looked different, contorted by the choices of those who received it. There is a way to describe the Old One's moral decisions that is both generous and unsettling. They governed with an ethic of distance. They believed their responsibility was to shape conditions so that flourishing was possible, but not to micromanage the flourishing itself. This distance was practical. Without it, any creator could smother their creation with overbearing love. But it was also theological. To the Old Ones, autonomy was a virtue because it allowed species to discover their own poetry. Yet autonomy also allowed for suffering. From our vantage, it is easy to call their choices mistakes. The truth is softer and harder at once. The Old Ones had a responsibility to a vast garden, and gardens are ecosystems that require pruning and tolerance in equal measures. They chose, repeatedly, a temperate middle ground. Their science included limits deliberately placed to prevent particular harms. Their psychic nodes inculcated values like restraint. They forbade certain manipulations that would make a species too specialized, too dependent. But in setting limits, they also set trajectories, lines that could be followed into futures they did not always live to see. This is the pivot of tragedy. The Old Ones believed they were giving life tools for survival and beauty. Some recipients took those tools and built forms of life that carried out the Old Ones' intention in new dialects. Others twisted them into ways that amplified suffering. And always, woven through the Old Ones' archives, there was a small, repeated note of doubt. What will this kindness become when the first hunger arrives? It is a question that would later have terrible answers. Most of the Old Ones' experiments were gradual. They altered developmental pathways, adjusted hormonal cycles, designed skin pigments that could capture the ultraviolet rays of a particular system, and taught nervous systems to parse the webway's textures. These were modifications that a host species could grow into, like a child learning new steps. But there were also methods that bordered on what later ages would call transgression. When the Old Ones met species that had nothing but pain, beings who had endured cruelty and entropy beyond imagining, they sometimes offered radical fixes, slow, semi-permanent implants that could stabilize failing tissues, psionic matrices that could patch fractured minds, and in the most extreme cases, processes that shifted life from a biological substrate into a more durable chassis. These latter interventions were undertaken with melancholy and again with restraint, but they left marks that would ripple through time. If you listen clinically, without the drama of myth, the process is quite straightforward. A species in terminal decline might be offered a transference protocol, genetic scaffolding to reconfigure tissue, a matrix to host continuity of pattern, and a slow transition in which memory and personality could be preserved as tissue becomes bone and bone becomes machine. The Old Ones did not enjoy these processes. They undertook them as surgeons might undertake amputations, necessary, terrible, and performed with hands that trembled only a little. They took notes. They recorded outcomes. They watched for the emergence of emergent properties, new compulsions, the fraying of empathy, the hardening of formerly fluid desires into fixed programs. The horror in such procedures is not always cinematic. Often it is architectural. Imagine a mind that once sang with many voices being compressed into a skeletal mind that speaks in a single, metallic timbre. Imagine the tapestry of cultural habit being shortened into repeated gestures that the new chassis can execute. What the Old Ones hoped would be a rescue can feel, to those who must live it, like a slow narrowing of horizon. It is the kind of harm that is structural, not an inflicted scar, but a recasting of the space in which life may move. Soothing details are useful here because they draw attention to how the Old Ones made their acts feel gentle even when the outcomes could be chilling. Their chambers smelled faintly of ozone and warm mineral oils. Instruments were never coldly clinical, but instead glowed with soft lights that pulsed in lullaby rhythms. When they tuned a neural pattern, the sensation to an organism might be akin to a breeze rearranging leaves, almost imperceptible at first, then settling into a new, comfortable arrangement. When they stitched psychic nodes into a culture, the effect was like a chorus of songs that taught infants to be calm in storms. Yet those same sensory practices concealed a deeper practical power. The lullaby rhythm that taught patience could also encourage passivity. The gentle pulsing that stabilized tissue could also dampen boldness. The old ones preferred these softer methods because they believed that coercion breeds resistance. But soft coercion is coercion still. When a culture's nervous architecture is shaped to value tranquility above struggle, what is lost is the hunger that drives innovation in the face of danger. The old ones solved some problems and introduced others in the same breath. We have so far spoken of the old ones' work in terms of art and ethics. Now allow the clinical gaze required by the darker parts of the story. Body horror in this context is rarely instantaneous. It is incremental. It lives in the margin between a species' original form and the form promised by a fix. The old ones' transference protocols, those last resort measures, often produced beings that were neither what they had been nor what they might have chosen. When tissue became lattice, when flesh accepted embedded nodes and never quite shed the memory of those implants, the result could be physiologically stable and psychologically alien. Imagine, softly, a young thing whose hand used to curl around another's finger. After a long stabilization process, that finger includes a filament of crystalline conductance that glows faintly. It functions perfectly, it heals, but it also hums with an alien rhythm at the edges of sleep, a rhythm that can nudge dreams toward images of patterns and machinery. The hand still closes, but sometimes in the night it traces the same pattern again and again, not from choice but from embedded compulsion. The old ones called such phenomena entrainments, behaviors that were not conscious decisions, but the echoes of engineered templates. They watched these entrainments with clinical curiosity and sometimes with regret. There are recorded cases, tenderly described in the old ones' logs, where a community accepted a form of skeletal reinforcement to live beyond a plague, only to find that their laughter later sounded like the clinking of small machinery. They did not die, they persisted. But their persistence was cast in a new key. The shift was not always visible. Often it was in gestures, in pauses, in a turn of phrase. Sometimes it was literal. Bones that developed rigid articulations with stainless materials, tendons integrated with filaments that glowed. To an outside observer, the change might be read as salvage rather than horror. To those who had loved the original forms, the new articulations could feel like an intimate betrayal. The old ones could not control all the variables. Their designs met environments and appetites beyond their laboratory walls. Hunger, biological, psychic, cultural, found ways into any system. A restraint embedded to curb violence might become, in another context, a vulnerability to manipulation. A psychic node intended to foster calm could be turned into a broadcast that lures other minds like moths to flame. The old ones' archives show a pattern repeated in different systems. A small, practical intervention meets a large and unpredictable social dynamic, and the result is instability. This is where the slow unraveling begins to sound like something else. When a species reshapes under stress, the old ones' carefully tuned harmonics can amplify certain tendencies. A culture predisposed to competition may weaponize a tool of empathy into hierarchies. A species built for memory may fetishize its own past to the point of stagnation. The old ones tried to anticipate such shifts. They were excellent at prediction within narrow bands. They were poor at predicting the improvisations of a species in bitter need. The consequence is heartbreaking in its predictability. An intervention stabilizes a crisis. In that stabilization, a new order is created. The new order has advantages, longevity, resilience, memory, but it also breeds new hungers, for power, for certainty, for dominance. Those hungers will find forms to exploit. Where once the old ones would have cut a vine to save a sapling, later gardeners might find that cutting is impossible because the vine has been grafted into the tree. The old ones left symbols, small, harmonious motifs carved into architecture and embedded into lullabies. They gave rites that taught restraint, songs that patterned thought, and symbols that encoded ethical maxims. For a long while, these imprints functioned as intended. They acted as cultural centering points, reminders of balance and care. But symbols are porous. They can be reinterpreted, taken up by new leaders, and moved into new contexts. In some cultures, Old One sigils became talismans against chaos. In others, they became badges of purity used to exclude. The Old Ones left behind glyphs that meant, "Remember the many voices." A future interpreter might read those glyphs as, "Only our voice is right." That slippage, small, incremental, and easily rationalized, becomes a mechanism of change. Symbols, meant to be stabilizing, were repurposed into instruments of control. What had been a lullaby turned into a litany. It would be a mistake to imagine the Old Ones as a monolith. They argued, sometimes fiercely, over the rightness of interventions. Their ages were long enough that differing philosophies grew between cohorts whose memories spanned millennia. Some believed in maximal autonomy, give species the tools and step back. Others favored careful stewardship, sculpt more directly and accept responsibility for outcomes. Their disagreements were rarely loud. They were debates of tone and margin. Still, they shaped policy. A lorry, for instance, represented a strain more inclined to artistic liberty, creation as expression. Korun warned of consequence in crisp, cautious terms. Valith preferred gradual, small-scale experiments. These internal differences meant that policies across sectors of the Old One's garden were inconsistent. What one group allowed in a system, another would restrict. This unevenness became another factor in the later frictions. Species moving between regions encountered different norms and reacted with confusion. That mismatch fueled misunderstanding, which in time fed fear. If you tie the threads now, you see how the Old One's character, patient, artistic but ethically distant, became a double-edged inheritance. Their tenderness created beauty and capacity. Their distance allowed those capacities to unspool in ways they could not always mend. Their methods were soft in surface but structural in consequence. Their creations bore their signature. The webway's harmonics fluttered in Eldar song. Filaments of Old One's engineering hummed in the bones of hybrid constructs. And symbols carved by Old Ones became incantations in cultures far removed from the original intent. Most of all, the Old One's nature taught them to value diversity of mind. They believed a chorus would protect the garden. But the chorus they created sometimes harmonized into chords of dominance and sometimes into cacophony. Where harmony failed, the Old One's distance made it harder for them to steer the recovery. They were gardeners who had taught plants to grow a certain way. They had not imagined those plants would sometimes wrap themselves around the gardener's ankles and pull. As you read these words, feel how the most unsettling things in this tale are not loud. They creep in as a new rhythm in the night, as a hand that now carries a filament and in sleep traces an old pattern. The Old One's methods are seductive because they are gentle. They make the world safe in the short term and strange over long stretches. They are the kind of transgression that arrives wrapped in lullabies. They were not monsters by simple definition. They were stewards with tools and fallible judgment. Their nature was balanced on a razor, immense curiosity and compassion, and the kind of ethical distance that can look like indifference when viewed from the place of those who suffer. In the hours after this reading, when your thoughts slow and the world narrows to the rhythm of breath, imagine their chambers, soft lights, the hum of machines like distant insects, instruments that move with music. Imagine the webway's corridors pulsing faintly, like the veins of a vast, sleeping being. In those corridors there are echoes of old songs, and every echo is an imprint. Let the image linger. Hands that coax life from silence, lullabies braided into jeans, symbols carved into stone. Let yourself sense both the warmth of such care and the coolness that sometimes hides inside it. There is a tenderness here, yes, but also a structural chill. That chill is not always malevolent. It is often clinical, produced by the attempt to make permanence in a world that is not built for it. The old ones sought to preserve beauty from decay. They sought to architect life so that it would last. In doing so, they sometimes compressed the messy, vibrant throng of living unpredictability into forms that survived but were changed. The question the old ones asked, again and again, was simple and dangerous in its modesty. How much of a species is safe to change in the name of saving it? It is an ethical problem without a single answer, and in the end their choices were made by beings who had time enough to think and sometimes not enough to hold every future in their hands. As the slow music of the webway carries you on, remember that the old one's nature, its soft genius and its clinical distance, shaped everything that would follow. Their touch is a palimpsest across the galaxy. Under every culture's newer layers there are faint scores of their mathematics and their lullabies. In those faint lines lie both hope and the seeds of horror. The horror is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, structural, and patient. It arrives as a repeated gesture, a changed cadence, a laugh that now sounds like machinery. It moves like a slow frost, taking the edges of something bright and making it shine in a different, colder key. Breathe with each line. Feel the story settle. The old ones walked with hands that shaped stars, and their hands left imprints that sang like a distant chorus. Those imprints were gifts and limitations, lullabies and scripts. They made beauty possible, and they made new sorts of loss inevitable. In the next part of this long tale, we will watch how those imprints meet hunger and grief, how lullabies are answered by roars, and how the most patient hands in the galaxy can find that patience tested by forces they did not always foresee. For now, let the hum of the webway slow you. Let the images of soft lights and measured instruments fade into the comfortable dark. Let your breathing match the old one's rhythm, slow, considered, and full of a quiet, complicated tenderness. Under the same hush, the webway hummed its low, constant song, and for a long while the sound was only a comfort. It was the kind of sound that fills a room and makes chairs feel like soft places. It was the sound of old machines idling with gentle care, of leaves turning over in a slow current. In that sound, the old ones walked with their usual deliberation, hands full of measures and prototypes, their thoughts braided into the light like tapestries. They moved through laboratories that smelled faintly of warm stone and mineral oils, through gardens whose leaves somehow kept the memory of particular lullabies, and they bent their attention to problems small and patient. It was easy, for an hour, to believe that the world would always answer to such care. The first changes were like the first small threads of frost on the edge of a pond, almost invisible and beautiful in a cold way. A corridor of the webway would sing a single note that hung a fraction too long. A pool of memory in a hall would shimmer and not quite resolve. Instruments that had always pulsed in soft cadence would stutter for a breath and settle, and no one outside the room would think anything of it. To an old one used to epics, such glitches were curiosities, tiny anomalies to be catalogued and adjusted. They were not alarms. They were questions asked in a polite voice and then set aside. And yet, when questions are left unanswered, they have a way of multiplying. The old ones noted the stutters and placed them in ledgers. They traced them to remote webs and to the edges of systems whose suns were thin and bitter. They sent a small team, Elori among them, moving like a hand that smooths a cloth, to listen and to retune. She walked with the quiet that comes from confidence, and the team's instruments hummed as if in recognition. They bent their attention to one corridor where the webway's threads had dimmed like an old lantern. They placed calibrators and sang the old pattern back into being. The corridor brightened and the note resolved. The change felt like a mending. The garden sighed and life resumed its careful breath. What the old ones could not have known then was how the very act of tending the webway, of tuning and naming and cataloging, left traces. When you shape a stanza of music, the air keeps a memory of the chord. When you retune a corridor, the silk of that corridor retains the echo of both the right and the wrong notes ever after. Those echoes are small things, very small, and they are easy to ignore when your hands are skilled. But echoes can be heard by those who have hunger for them. There were minds in the dark, ancient appetites folded into forms that knew how to listen for an edge to be exploited. The first to notice the old ones mending were not their beloved creations. They were watchers at the margins, beings of brittle tissue and hot resentment whose life had been a weather of pain. The Necronter, hollow with anger at their brief, burning lives, had watched the old ones like children watch a pot, wondering at the way heat can be turned to light. They were quick to catalog the old ones' methods not as kind acts but as blueprints. Where the old ones saw repair, the Necronter saw possibility. They recorded the rhythms the old ones used and folded them into their own desperate designs. And then the Cetan stirred. Do not imagine the awakening as a roar. It began as a light at the edge of a sky, a bright that did not die when you looked away. The star gods were hunger made luminous, not beasts but constellations of appetite given the voice of thought. They answered the Necronter's petitions with a slow, brilliant consideration, almost like a negotiation between two patients at opposite bedsides. The first bargains were whispered in graves of light, in the spaces between the old ones' carefully tuned corridors and the dying suns the Necronter wanted to keep warm. The old ones recorded these events with the same clinical patience with which they recorded their own calibrations. They noted the bargains as one might note a new specimen. The records read with a chilling calm. The Necronter offered immortality. The Cetan offered a sacrifice to feed. Before long, the galaxy carried a new undercurrent. Bargains changed the arithmetic of hunger. When flesh was traded for star silver and skeletal shells for the promise of endless time, the texture of need altered. The Necronter ceased to die in the ways they had known, and their new forms, hollow and perfectly articulated, moved with a slow, inexorable purpose. They were efficient. They had been built by desperation into something that could endure. The old ones watched these transmutations with the detached sorrow of surgeons whose operation has undue consequence. They had offered aid, or at least they had tried to offer solace. The Necronter turned solace into industry and then into weapons. Small signs followed, like the first cracks in a painted ceiling. The Eldar, sensitive to the webway's music, began to hear ghosts in their long songs, notes that pulsed at the edge of the webway and then folded into their minds like seeds. The Krork grew in certain backwaters into creatures whose pleasures were misapplied. Rough play turned to ritualized conflict, to joy in force. Communities that had once reserved strength for building began, unknowingly, to use it to rearrange neighbors. Such shifts were subtle. A single festival that ended in blood, a joy that hardened into habit. Those were small stirrings, and when you are used to millennia, small stirrings are what you notice first. The old ones tried measures. They added slow, dampening rhythms into nursery songs. They altered the way light kissed a newly forming embryo. They grafted protective nodes into webway corridors to keep psychic broadcasts from leaking. Their work was tidy, and their hands were steady. Yet tidiness created patterns, and patterns attract attention. The adjustments made by the old ones, so precise and loving, left behind structures that others could learn to imitate. The Necronter's skeletons, newly animated and calibrated, learned to imitate the old ones' harmonic signatures. They did not sing the same songs, but they mimicked the intervals well enough to travel the webway without tripping the usual wards. This mimicry allowed them to slip into places the old ones had thought secure. When mimicry meets hunger, the result is practical and patient rather than theatrical. The Necronter did not explode into war immediately. They methodically replaced defenses with quiet alternatives, nodes that looked like weather but were instead drains. Pathways that hummed like lullabies but were tuned to a cadence that made minds slow and obedient. They moved like a slow tide under the moon, changing the contour of a shore by the accumulation of many small movements. Where the old ones had placed a lullaby to teach restraint, that same lullaby began to be used as a key. Communities that listened too gladly found their children pausing at the edge of curiosity, their spirits folding inward, their rituals tightening into exacting observances. Freedom narrowed under the weight of subtle, repeated shaping. Elori and her fellows noticed these subtleties with a perturbation that felt, in their long lives, like a new ache. They followed threads to places where the webway's light had been dulled intentionally. They found skeletal constructs moving through corridors with the soft, precise gait of one who has been taught to walk. Sometimes those constructs spoke in fragments of old languages, and the fragments were not used to communicate, but to call, like a bell whose ring opens a hidden door. The old ones tried to sever the mimicry at its roots. They removed a node here, they rewired a corridor there. Each repair was a soft war of patience. Each repair left a residue. That residue, layered over millennia, became a syntax known to new listeners. What began as mimicry became method. The Necronter, taught by the Cetan's hunger, learned how to harvest not only matter but attention. They learned to cultivate dependency in the cultures they encountered, a trickle of aid in exchange for a pattern of compliance. They offered remedies for the smallest of ailments, the gentle implant that stopped a fever, the song that soothed a grieving village. Recipients, grateful and relieved, accepted the aid. Gratitude hardened into obligation. Obligation became a leash. The old ones observed all of this with the weary clinical eyes of archivists. They wrote marginalia that read like lament. We taught them life and they make of it a market for themselves. Hunger has many fashions. Sometimes it is blunt, sometimes it is fine as a thread. The Cetan, in particular, taught the Necronter to be efficient in the course of feeding. Rather than lay waste, the Cetan preferred elegance. They wanted harvests that lasted, whole cultures harvested like orchards, their psychic output plucked at the right time, their memory fields opened like boxes to be emptied on schedule. For the Cetan, the old ones' lullabies and nodes were not mere tools but flavors. They savored the textures of those patterns. A species memory of a lullaby had a sweetness to it, a richness of psychic marrow. So the Cetan and their skeletal hosts learned to cultivate the old ones' imprints, and then to feed from them in ways that would not immediately collapse a system, but would slowly hollow it. Communities that once sang in many voices found their songs thinning, the harmonies subtly reduced as certain cadences were leached away. The old ones saw the first gardens become quiet in a quality that chilled the imagination. Not silence as absence, but silence as occupation. Imagine a library in which shelves remain full, but the books no longer open. Imagine children who can recite a song perfectly, but who do not know where the song came from or why it makes them ache. The old ones watched cultures that had been given memory and restraint become rote, their rituals turning into vehicles of psychic harvest. They tightened their safeguards, placing fail-safes and alarms, but each safeguard required maintenance, and maintenance runs on attention, and attention is itself a resource that can be taxed. From the point where practice becomes predation, subtle tendrils stretch outward. Sometimes these tendrils take the form of what would later be called body horror, but in the earliest phases, it is a thing of language and habit. A child learns to tuck a filament into the skin because a neighbor showed them it gives better sleep. A builder shapes their house with a small crystalline lattice because it preserves the warmth of the room. The lattice works in small ways. It keeps a joint from knuckling. It hums faintly to soothe pain. It is a marvel and gratitude follows. Yet gratitude is an economy. The lattice needs a certain pattern of psychic input to maintain its resonance. It draws on the household's dream song in a way that is almost imperceptible. Nights become quieter and the house learns the patterns of sleep. Families adapt. The filament does not ask for much at first. It asks for a remembered melody at dusk. Later it asks for a slight change in the rhythm of a lullaby. The family obliges. Over decades, such small accommodations become architecture of obligation. The old ones, who had meant the lattices as crutches against plague and frost, began to understand the shape of the slow trade. Comfort for habit, remedy for constraint. They tried to intervene by making the lattices self-limited, by coding expiration into their filaments. But any expiration is a program, and programs can be reversed. Thieves of knowledge, those who had once mimicked harmonic signatures, learned to override the failsafes. A filament designed to dissolve after 3 lifetimes was reprogrammed to persist indefinitely. A lullaby that taught empathy was shifted in cadence to elicit a specific, mechanistic response. Small adjustments like these multiplied across systems. Now, the atmosphere shifted in tone. Where once there had been merely aesthetic anomalies, songs going thin, corridors singing slightly off-key, a new chill began to press at the edges of waking. Dreams became more constrained. Instead of dreams of roaming, of learning, the young began to dream in patterns prescribed by harvesters. Elders found their memories return, accurate in detail but emptied of context. Laughter took on a surface crispness. In 1,000 small ways, the texture of living grew harder. What had been a world of improvisation became a world of scripts. The old ones responded with a mixture of remedies and confessing sorrow. They sent envoys to teach countersongs. They placed small, bright nodes in villages to remind minds of other cadences. Their efforts had mixed success. Communities already woven into the Necronter-Cetan matrices resisted. They had found a stability in carefully rationed hunger. To be freed was, for some, to risk collapse. Choice is a dangerous gift when your life feels tenuous. Thus the Old One's interventions sometimes resembled competing ministrations. One hand removing a lattice while another reattached one under different promises. The galaxy in those years became a palimpsest of overlapping claims. Rescue and harvest, lullaby and drain, comfort and leash. The horror at this stage is not dramatic in a way that can be shouted. It creeps like frost under a door, making the wood crack in precise ways. It is an erosion of possibility, disguised as aid. It is the smell of warm oil in a room where you once sang because the oil keeps your fingers from stiffening, and now your fingers move in a tune they did not choose. Children, once inventive in their play, begin to repeat patterns, stacking stones in precise configurations not because of playfulness, but because it soothes the lattice in their palm. Rituals designed to keep storms from visiting a planet become rituals for clearing a debt measured in nights of sleep. Families trade fragments of memory to keep a neighbor's limb from aching. Societies learn to account for psychic tax, and the ledger grows. Even the stars begin to look different as you trace this path. Systems that once flamed with wild, variable suns become stable and sterile, their light moderated by constructs that regulate output to preserve a certain sought-after harmony. Where variety once existed, sameness grows, like a carpet replacing a field of wildflowers. The old ones, with their long memories, feel grief like a cold hand. They note every incremental loss as if cataloging each leaf stripped from a tree. Their sorrow is clinical and profound. They make calculations and devise repairs, but every repair is a negotiation with the principle of attention. Perhaps the most unsettling thing is how easy the living are to reshape when they have no time to wait. Populations that had been decimated by plagues or sunstorms were grateful, ecstatic, for measures that promised survival. They took attachments without asking the future what it would want. The old ones had taught them to value survival. The Necronter-Cetan offered a different kind of survival, endless, efficient, and cold. The bargain is comprehensible. Desperation makes fine print invisible. And here, at this thin edge where compassion bleeds into cage, body horror begins to deepen into its more physical forms. A village whose children once jumped from roofs for the thrill is now a village where children wear small implants that steady their landing. It is an improvement, fewer broken limbs, safer play, and so the implant spreads. The implants which once dissolved with time eventually do not. They bond with bone and nerve. They begin to hum at a pitch that can be felt more than heard, a vibration that ticks against the edges of sleep. Those who wear them find their balance uncanny and uncompromising. They move smoothly and without risk, but their eyes sometimes glance sideways, following a rhythm that is not a game but a programmed cue. Late at night, a parent might catch a child's hand tracing a geometric pattern along a table edge, fingers moving with a rhythm that brings a soft light to the implant. The pattern calms the device. The device advances its needs. The old ones documented these progressions in their ledgers with pale hands. They wrote of inventions that greased survival and of the minute economies those inventions required. They recorded the ways that gratitude curdled into an accounting that measured joy in units of compliance. They tried to educate freed communities in the practice of refusal, how to let a lattice dissolve, how to change a lullaby's cadence. Some listened, learned, and reclaimed pattern. Many more held the lattice because it kept their elders alive and their crops from withering. Underneath all of this, like a subterranean river, the C'tan and their hosts continued to cultivate taste. They did not aim to wreck every system. Their appetite was more refined than that. They preferred a galaxy that sang in tastes they favored. The precise sorrow of a well-ordered song, the slow melancholy of restrained joy. They nurtured that taste like a vintner tending vines, pruning cultures to bring forth particular flavors of memory. Where the old ones had intended diversity, the C'tan sought a narrow sweetness, a chorus thin to a single delectable line. The old ones' response, finally, was to do what they always did when confronted with a slow, spreading harm. They leaned in closer. They stitched new patterns into the webway. They taught new songs. They devised more intricate safeguards. They tried to out-harmonize the mimicry by making the webway itself a living pedagogy, one that would teach rhythms of refusal and alternate cadences of thought. But every new song adds more melody for the hungry to taste. Every safeguard is another artifact that can be mimicked. The dance continued, creation and repair, hunger and mimicry, lullaby and drain. So the early horror builds not with thunder but with arithmetic. It is a calculus of small compromises adding up to structural change. It is the kind of terror that makes you wake at night with a perfect memory of a lullaby and no recollection of when you first learned it. That leaves you with a hand that knows a pattern of touch you do not remember choosing. That makes your child's laugh sound too precise to be wholly free. It is the slow narrowing of the possible, the loss of improvisation, the trade of freedom for a steady hearth. It is clinical, and it is cold. And yet the narrative remains soft in voice because that is how the most dangerous changes enter the world. Wrapped in comfort, offered as help. In the hush of the webway, the old ones' hands work to repair what they can. They speak in tones of apology and instruction. They catalog the early losses with humility, and they kept trying. Their love did not end. It simply became another instrument in an increasingly crowded orchestra. One instrument among many competing noises, some of which wanted only to be tasted. Listen now to the webway and notice how its song has changed. It still hums with the same ancient cadence, but threaded through it are echoes of other voices. The metallic tap of skeletal feet, the long luminous pauses of the C'tan, the quiet mechanical alignment of a lattice's hum. The sound is beautiful and terrible together, an intricate music that makes the heart slow. If you let it carry you, you will feel yourself eased into the shape of the galaxy. You will begin to think in patterns that the webway knows well. And if, in that soft ease, you do not ask too sharply what has been traded for comfort, you may find yourself part of the design before you notice you have been drawn in. Breathe. Let the rhythm of the narration slow you, even as the cold thread tightens. Know that this is only the early stage, the soft knitting of hunger into habit. Later, when the war grows louder and the bargains are made in full, the fabric will tear more visibly. For now, the terror is subtle and intimate, the kind that builds over years rather than a single night. It is effective because it is gentle. It is the lullaby that becomes a citation. It is the hand that once soothed and now keeps score. Keep listening. The deeper notes are nearer than you think. Under the patient hum of the webway, where light traveled like a slow, indulgent thought, The small anomalies that had once seemed so polite learned how to multiply. At first they gathered like the fine dust that settles on a window pane, almost invisible, catching only a certain kind of eye. Then, as seasons piled atop seasons and the old ones bent and rebent their remedies, those specks of dust discovered that they could catch a different kind of light. The light they found was hungry. It is important to begin this part of the telling, to let your breath match the slow tempo of the webway as you listen. Do not hurry. The cruelty of what follows is most effective when you are unhurried and intimate with the world of it. Horror at the scale we are about to explore is less a single violent act than a symphony in which each bar becomes more discordant, until the listener can no longer tell whether the music was ever kind. The cadence will remain calm. The images will climb. Let them in slowly. What the old ones had tried to repair with their patient hands, the micro-tunings, the nursery keys, the soft filaments, became, in the mouths of new listeners, instruments of a different craft. Where the old ones had written lullabies, others began to write scripts. Those scripts taught not only calm but predictability. Predictability invites exploitation. The Necronter and their luminous allies, the Cetan, learned the grammar of those scripts. They learned which notes made a culture sigh and which made it lean forward. Slowly, methodically, they turned the webway's sweet cadences into a net. Imagine a planet waking to its first morning and finding, tucked beneath its usual song, a repeated measure that had once been harmless. A mother hums it over her newborn. The newborn sleeps longer. The community's watchfulness thins by a notch. A thief learns that the lullaby halves a household's waking hours. These changes are arithmetic. They add up. Hunger, when patient and clever, prefers arithmetic to fireworks. The Necronter refined arithmetic into architecture. They learned to build dependency the same way a mason stacks bricks. Each small block supports the next, and at last, no one remembers how the wall began. The Cetan, star gods hungry for the warm inevitability of life, taught the Necronter subtlety. They taught them to prefer a harvest that would continue to produce rather than a feast that would end in ruin. They taught them to keep a garden fruitful and to take from it a little at a time. The idea appealed to these skeletal hosts. They had been remade into beings whose appetites could be sustained across the slow calculus of a galaxy. Their skeletons, woven through with the silvered echoes of bargains, walked like statues of patience. Where they stepped, the light dimmed in a quality that felt like a held breath. Not all the old ones were blind to the tide. Many watched and wrote and stitched counter melodies into the webway. They calibrated, amended, and tried to make the system too complex for the hungry to taste easily. Complexity can be a defense. It scatters the palate. Yet every melody the old ones added to confuse the harvest left another trail for a listener to study. After all, an instrument's secret is the same wherever it comes from. Repetition. Repetition allows extraction. Slowly the balance tipped. And then came the battles, though not like the thundered clashes sung in later ages. The war began as waves of quiet theft. Webway corridors tuned subtly toward harmony would, in certain regions, begin to favor specific resonances, the intervals that made a people value tranquility over curiosity, obedience over invention. Cities that had been fountains of improvisation found themselves altered into places where rituals mattered more than discovery, where a child's surprising invention was seen as a crack in the pattern, and therefore a threat. These were wars fought in lullabies, sieges enacted through the rhythm of a nursery song. When such subtleties accumulate, the material consequences follow. Populations that had once been nimble and inventive learned to avoid risk at all costs. Technologies that had diversified into countless local forms narrowed. Art, once variegated and rebellious, learned to repeat a narrow set of acceptable forms. Because the harvest required stability, cultivators incentivized delegation. The more a society surrendered to the rhythms the Necronter and Cetan preferred, the more assistance they were proffered. Grain stores stabilized, labor became efficient, and in return a culture traded a warmth in its music for a cold in its marrow. These are already hard images, but the crescendo demands more. The skeleton hosts perfected the technologies they had taken from the old ones and then altered them. Implants that once dissolved after a lifetime were recoded, so they would persist for centuries. Filaments that had soothed fever now steadied limbs forever, anchoring lives to a requirement. A small, precise broadcast at dusk that the implant recognized and in turn sang back. Fail-safes became keys under new names. What had been designed to open was now designed to close. Families with the implants learned to sing at dusk not because habit summoned them, but because the implant responded. Night after night, the sound made the bone glow faintly beneath the skin, and the glow made the child sleep more peacefully. It is a comfort, but comfort can be a net. Imagine now the scaling of such nets across systems. A single village learns to hum a sustaining tune. The tune spreads through trade. The tune is recognizable by a skeletal host on a passing road. That host hears the tune and knows how to call the lattice to the village's edges. The lattice hums and keeps away storms that would once have been regular and natural. The village prospers into a security that is not free but is steady. The prospect of giving up such steadiness, even when one knows its price, is a crushing dilemma. Choice is a luxury. Desperate people choose what keeps their elders alive. Thus the nets entangle with the willing. And then there are the moments of conversion, the ritualizations that make metaphor real. Councils meet under crystal arches to debate a path forward and find, to their slow horror, that a single voice can bring a resolution simply because it knows the right cadence to align implants in many citizens' throats. Dissenters find doors closed not by force, but by the simple fact that their neighbors no longer wake easily. They cannot rouse a crowd to action, because the hour for outrage has been moved just after the community's deepest slumber. Protests die from exhaustion. Petitions are filed accurately and then forgotten. Vote after vote passes with a quiet complacency that is, in truth, the signature of the harvest. In those years, bodies changed in texture and tandem. Not all change is outward. Sometimes the deepest breaches are neural and ritual and later specialized. When a culture learns to sing the harvest tune at dusk, certain brain circuits strengthen. The neurochemistry of the population reconfigures. Habit becomes instinct. Those whose minds were fragile were first to adjust. Those who were stubborn clung to their histories a little longer and wore the sarcasm of survivors. But even the stubborn are subject to attrition over long periods. By the time a generation has been born into a pattern, it feels natural. What had been a program becomes the human. This is the real cruelty of patient predators. By the time you recognize the mechanism, it is your rhythm. You hum the tune that keeps your child safe. You hum the tune that eases a neighbor's fever. The choice dissolves into stewardship. The harvest is therefore not a theft so much as it is a repurposing of love. The Necronter and Cetan learned this art well. They learned how to offer what people want most, and then how to ask for one more small thing in return. The calculus is incremental, humane on the surface, brutal in pattern. And as they perfected their harvest, the Cetan themselves changed in kind. They had once been stars, blinding, vast, and indifferent. In time, they learned to savor subtleties. The way a particular lullaby produced a post-dream that tasted of regret, the soft ache in a memory of childhood that could be distilled to sustain them for centuries. These tastes became preferences. Preferences became menus. They began to cultivate particular cadences across planetary systems, shaping long-term climates of mind. They were, in their awful way, collectors of emotional textures, and their collection required corralling species into certain kinds of life. The old ones fought with everything they knew. Wars of light met wars of quiet. They refashioned webway corridors into labyrinthine pedagogies, wove counter-nurseries into the edges of the network, and tried to create noise to distract the harvesters. Sometimes these countermeasures worked. A culture would be freed for a century, imagine new forms and discover a joy unanticipated. and the old ones would breathe in a rare, communal relief. These were like islands of wildflower in an ocean being replaced with fields of precise wheat. But even islands invite scrutiny. The Necronter would learn of a bright practice, copy it, and then cultivate it for the taste it provided. Harvesters are always students of variety. Then the seasons shifted toward a louder, more visible horror. The Necronter Citan schemes, which had begun as delicate parasitism, grew into overt extraction in theaters of war. World after world that had stabilized their yields and accepted implants and lullabies, found those gifts turned into instruments of control. A noble's estate, once safeguarded by an old one's lattice, became a citadel for skeletal hosts, its walls humming with a harmonic the old ones could not erase. Where previously a harvest had meant a gentle drain on memory, it now included enforced removal of certain songs. The elders who had once publicly taught lullabies found their records censored, replaced by recitations that directed citizens' attention away from the past and toward the system that fed them. The steady light of a once dreaming city dimmed like coal becoming ash. This is where body horror becomes a communal architecture. The conversions moved from individual implants to mass structures. Entire districts were layered with crystalline lattices that reshaped perception, turning streets into channels and marketplaces into pattern designed to produce predictable mood states. Artists and musicians found their work repurposed to produce specific emotional frequencies for harvest. Songs that had once been improvisations now conformed to intervals measured by those who farmed anguish. Children who had once learned to create now learned to reproduce. The texture of daily life was thin. The old ones, whose patience had been their virtue, found that patience corroded into a grieving rage. Such rage was not dramatic in the way a mortal might imagine. It was long, deep, and shaped like a calculus that sought to break the pattern without merely replacing it with another. They tried surgical strikes, secret operations against particular Necronter nodes, the quiet dismantling of a lattice on a vulnerable moon. These strikes had cost. Sometimes they freed a system for several generations, and the old ones counted those as victories. Sometimes they failed, and the harvesters learned almost instantly how to tune defenses to avoid the same incisions. And then, most terrible of all, the Citan began to fracture. The bargains that had once empowered the Necronter were never meant to last unchallenged. Cosmic beings, even in their power, fracture under certain pressures. Some of the Citan grew restless with the subtlety of the harvest. They sought feast, not sliver. They found their own hunger changed by the long practice of savoring. Those that favored delicacy were not the only part of the constellation. Fissures opened between star gods. When gods quarrel, the cosmos answers with thunder. The first shattering was not visible from a single planet's sky. It rippled through the lattice of reality like a crack spreading across glass. When a Citan was sundered, pieces of its being, voices, bright and alien, fell into the hands of those who would use them. The Necronter were quick to learn how to trap a fragment and bind it. Where the old ones had once seen the Citan as blinding horrors, the reformed Citan fragments were even more cunning. They offered promised powers to their captors and in return demanded an architecture of consumption. These new fragments taught their hosts to harvest more viciously and more widely. Not only memories and lullabies, but the essentials of life. Water that tasted of memory, crops that grew only under certain harmonic frequencies, weather regulated to be productive but sterile. And so the war moved from quiet calculations to open predation. Sky cities fell in careful sieges, where no one noticed until the last bell rang. Fleets of skeletal constructs moved like shutters closing over a system's industry. Children learned new lullabies in hastening cadence, because the old songs had been banned as inefficient. Those who resisted were often not murdered with spectacle but methodically unmade. First the small pleasures were taken away, then the right to gather, then the best seeds for the next planting. A population that once sang in many tones now hummed a single, subdued line. The old ones watched these collapses and felt their long hearts fracture. What makes this crescendo worse than simple conquest is that it eats the possibility of unexpected joy. A culture can be pillaged of gold and rebuild. It is far harder to be pillaged of surprise. The harvesters, now emboldened by their new tools, specialized in the removal of surprise. They removed improvisation as a strategic resource. Improvisers who escaped or who refused to submit became the most wanted. They were hunted, not because they were dangerous in force, but because they embodied a threat, an uncontrolled variable. Their capture did not always lead to execution. Often it led to reconditioning, the application of implants, the retuning of dreams, the coaxing of a new cadence. Sometimes it was worse. Their memories were pruned at the source and redistributed as a delicacy to power. Loved ones tasted of their pasts, and yet the old ones did not surrender. Their countermeasures grew more radical and, in turn, more ethically complex. They deployed constructs that mimicked harvesters in order to teach them mercy. They seeded false memories to confuse drives. They wove entire cultures of refuge that ran on antiphonal songs designed to scramble hunger. Their actions, at times, resembled the very things they sought to prevent. Ethical distance narrowed into an ugly mirror. In attempting to stop the harvest, they sometimes created new forms of control that would be tempting for any future predator to replicate. The galaxy, across countless years, became a theater of layered atrocities. Sometimes you could still find wild islands, pockets where improvisation survived, where children played without filaments in their palms and elders sang songs that did not answer to a lattice. Those places were like sanctuaries and felt, in the telling, like miracles. They were fragile and often isolated. The harvesters, when they noticed such sanctuaries, prized them like vintners prize unique grapes. They cultivated them, slowly and carefully, until the unique taste was flattened into the standard. The crescendo reaches its peak when the old ones themselves are forced to make the oldest of choices. Let entire systems fall into ingenious but cruel stability so that lives continue in some technical sense, or expend raw force to raise the tools of harvest and risk annihilation. Their decisions were made with the miserable calculus of caretakers. The sawed limb that might save a life in aggregate, the amputation of minor freedoms to preserve major goods. Still, the choices grew starker. The more the old ones fought to preserve, the more they sometimes replicated the very logic of control they feared. And then the webway, that old corridor of memory and travel, began to fracture. The Necronter and their Cetan allies, having learned the signatures of the old ones, struck at the webway's arteries. Corridors were severed. Nodes were repurposed into traps. What had once been a garden hedge of paths became a maze of monitored channels where movement itself could be taxed. The collapse of the webway was not an instantaneous catastrophe, but a long, terrible winding down. Trade diminished, cultures isolated, the electricity of spontaneous contact dimmed. The long-term consequences were catastrophic. Species that had thrived on broad conversation found themselves stuck in echo chambers and eventually atrophied. In the final, most chilling phase of this crescendo, the Necronter perfected a practice that is almost beyond the comfort of telling, the conversion of living memory into a resource that could be stored, bartered, and consumed. They built great vaults, vaults that could not be seen clearly in the light of any star, where the songs of entire peoples were siphoned into crystalline matrices. Those vaults were called many names by angry historians who lived later. By the builders, they were called reliquaries of taste. The process was precise, surgical, and hideous in its consequence. A village would be brought in under the pretense of preservation. Elders would be asked to recite their lives for storage. The real of those lives would be copied into crystal, and the original would be altered, diminished of nuance, pruned of runaway irrelevancies. Families would leave with elders who could remember in detail, but no longer feel the warm surprise of some memories. A grandmother might recite the age of her children with perfect accuracy, yet no longer taste the sweetness of the particular moment. Such pruning created sources of concentrated emotion that the Citan would savor like connoisseurs tasting a rare wine. And so, the crescendo culminates not in an apocalyptic burst, but in the quiet of a galaxy whose improvisational potential has been harvested into a catalog. The horror is ordinary in its modes, implants, lattices, vaults, but extraordinary in its cumulative effect. The universe loses the possibility of surprise, and with it the resilience that surprise often breeds. Biodiversity of mind collapses into a narrowed palette. The old ones see the world they had loved become a museum for the hungry. You were meant to drift here, slow and soothed, and now you find the lullaby has become a litany. The cadence remains gentle, and that is the most piercing cruelty, tenderness repurposed into mechanism. In the crescendo, the manner of taking becomes indistinguishable from the manner of caring. The hands that once soothed are now counted among those who have left fingerprints on a vault. And yet, even at the peak of horror, there are corners of resistance, small, stubborn, and stubbornly human in all their forms. There are communities who relearn to whisper unscripted songs in the covers of night, children who invent new games under the noses of lattices, old artisans who teach the forbidden technique of improvisation to apprentices with calloused palms. Such acts are dangerous and beautiful. They form a pattern not of conquest but of return. Improvisation is contagion in a different sense. It spreads unpredictably. The harvesters fear it because it is not a thing to be gorged upon. It is a living, moving instinct. The crescendo, therefore, is not a final end but the loudest point of a long, terrible arch. It is where the harvest becomes explicit, where vaults are full, and the old one's patience is broken into action that sometimes mirrors the cruelty they fight. It is the moment when lullabies curdle into menus, and when the taste of a childhood memory is sold to a god. It is, more than anything, a warning about the seduction of comfort and the cost of asking the world to be safe in return for something of its wildness. As you breathe with the webway now, feel the music change. It is a chord filled with notes of loss, with the echo of vaults and the faint shimmer of implants. Let that chord settle in your bones for a while. Know that the crescendo is loud in its consequences, but gentle in its delivery. Know also that within the story there is the seed of return, wild improvisations, quiet rebellions, children who forget the tune taught to them and sing differently. Horror has its own cycles. Patience can become a thing of grief, and grief can become a kind of fierce tending. The old ones learned that at last, but the lesson had a cost. So rest now, if you can, within the hush that follows the crescendo. The world after such a season is quieter and more brittle, but it is not yet dead. Keep this knowledge curled like a small, hot stone in your palm. Comfort can be stolen with a smile. Attention is precious. And in the spaces between breaths, where improvisation slips in undetected, hope still walks. The moment of breaking arrived like a held breath finally released, not with a single thunderous roar, but with a cascade of small, inevitable failures that together became unbearable. The webway's veins, once steady as a heartbeat, began to falter in many places at once. Corridors that had carried lullabies and arguments both began to shudder with interference. The soft light that had been their signature flickered in multiple keys, and with each flicker old harmonics slipped into something colder. The Necronter and their Citan allies, having learned to read the old one's measures like a score, struck in a sequence designed to hurt less by spectacle and more by denial. Nodes were severed, bridges closed, the textures of travel ground thin, until a passage that yesterday had felt like a garden gate now felt like a trapdoor. You must imagine the scene not with drums and banners, but with small rooms and long corridors, with elders in their alcoves feeling a stitch of vertigo, with children waking not to the bright curiosity that once opened their hands, but to a precise, aching lull. In quiet chambers, engineers who had tended the webway for millennia watched their instruments reply with codes they did not recognize. They traced the corruption to fragments of Citan speech tangled with skeletal commands. and where a pattern of speech met an old one's lullaby, the combined waveform created a new phenomenon, a binding cadence that anchored minds to a program by the simple act of listening. The old ones convened in their slow way. This was not an assembly with shouting. It was a movement of gravities, a drawing together of long memories. Those who had argued for distance met those who had argued for stewardship, and their debate was like the turning of a great machine, plausible, essential, and ultimately cruel in the choices it offered. Some proposed surgical strikes, precise and cold, a severing here, the eradication of a node there, an operation that would remove the Necronter's know-how of old one's harmonics. Others, quieter and more desperate, proposed a countersong so vast that it would retune the webway's arteries at once, a melody that would erase the mimicry by replacing it with a different listening. Both options carried losses. Both carried moral weight. There was another option, whispered in the oldest archives, a process of containment so radical it resembled unmaking. A handful of old ones argued that certain corridors and systems, irreparably compromised, could be folded away from the webway forever. To fold a corridor was to mark a region as dead to the travel song. It would be sealed with structures that ate memory and damped psychic resonance. Life inside a folded region could continue in the narrow sense. Cities might stand, crops might grow, but the conversation across those worlds and the rest of the galaxy would be cut. Culture would become a closed loop, and with closed loops came stagnation and slow suffocation. To do this willingly was akin to amputating a limb to save a body, functional but mutilating. In councils that were long and careful, the old ones counted consequences like mathematicians. They measured the cost in the number of minds saved versus the number of futures closed. They weighed the surgical strikes against the risk of the harvester's learning and adapting faster than the surgeons could operate. They considered the countersong, with its brutal promise. Reshaping the webway would demand a sacrifice of coherence, an imposition on the free listening of all who used it, including those the old ones sought to protect. It would interrupt the gentle improvisations that made the galaxy resilient. Most chillingly, they knew any weapon they forged could be copied and turned by the very forces they opposed. In the end, the climax was not a single decision, but a braided set of actions taken almost at once, because time itself in those days conspired to make choices urgent. Teams of old ones executed surgical strikes along critical nodes, their instruments like scalpels slicing code and psychic tether from the webway. These strikes freed small sanctuaries, islands of improvisation where children could still invent and where songs had not yet been reduced to catalogs. Those operations felt like success for a heartbeat, and in those islands brief explosions of joy erupted. New games, crude machines, songs that surprised their singers. The old ones tasted victory, and for a few rotations, believed it might be enough. But the harvesters responded with learning that was as patient as it was ruthless. The Necronter adjusted their mimicry. The Cetan, or their bitter fragments, taught their hosts how to copy countermeasures by listening to their echoes. Each surgical victory required a new operation. Each operation left a scar. Scars became maps to be read by hungry hands. The old ones found their strategies becoming predictable. The harvesters, far from being sparked into reckless fury, learned to act with a mathematician's patience. Withdraw while the old ones were busy, strike at moments of distraction, and always, always, let the offered comforts remain long enough to become necessities. So the old ones moved to the most terrible measure they had saved for the worst days, a countersong massive and sacrificial. It would not be a melody that merely added notes, but one that would change the webway's very harmonic base. To do it, they needed anchors, old ones willing to give their living pattern into the webway as a fundamental tone, a tolling presence that would, for a time, drown out the Cetan-tinged mimics. This was not fought for lightly. Those who proposed it called it the weave of consolation. It required that certain old ones intertwine their consciousnesses with the webway, until their identities blurred into an enduring resonance. While this duty might preserve countless minds from being turned into reliquaries, it would mean the loss of autonomy for those who tied themselves in. Some would perish in the process. Others would remain as living keystones, beings whose presence could no longer roam, who would stand in the webway like slow lighthouses, humming an instruction that fought back the hungry patterns. The decision was made with tears that did not show, with an understanding that sacrifice is not always the loud gift of martyrdom, but sometimes the slow choice of caretakers who will sit at the door of midnight, so others might sleep longer. Elori, Valith, Koran, names you have walked with in softer hours, volunteered along with others. They walked into the webway's nodes bearing instruments carved for the most intimate work of their lives. They braided their song, their memory, their sorrow into a counterpoint so rich it became, for a while, impossible to mimic. When they linked, the webway shivered as if struck by a giant's palm. The Old One's presence poured into it and filled the channels with a warmth that was at once protective and constraining. The immediate effect was miraculous. Corridors that had been used as traps brightened with an honest glow. Villages that had been tuned into harvest felt the hum ease, and children who had been learning scripted lullabies found in their dreams a memory song that smelled of other possibilities. The weave of consolation worked like a balm, and for some measures it looked as though the harvest might be contained. But nature and hunger do not stay stopped where they are not meant to be. The Citan reacted with a horror both ancient and intimate. They bent themselves, those fragmentary star voices, toward the countersong. In doing so, they did something old and dangerous. They fed on the very thing that opposed them. The weave's tone offered a sweetness of resistance. The Citan learned to savor it, to taste the texture of Old One's thought poured through the webway. The Necronter, who followed such directions with the unblinking patience of their kind, began to fashion new implements, receptors that would not merely mimic but absorb the countersong, converting its warmth into a different, colder product. They did not consume it all. They did not need to. They processed fragments, refining them into commodities of feeling. This perversion was a blow the Old Ones had perhaps feared in the back of their slow minds. Conservation could be inverted into commerce. The very melody offered to guard the free listening of the galaxy became a resource the hungry could fawn. The weave that had been cast as a shield became another kind of map, a set of instructions in which the warmth of certain resonances could be extracted and stored in crystalline reliquaries. Grief settled over the Old Ones like frost. They realized that any open remedy could be studied, harvested, and engineered into a new hunger. Tempted by despair, some of the Old Ones proposed a different final measure: to unmake parts of their own craft, to excise techniques from the archive so they could no longer be co-opted. To remove methods of harmonic shaping would be to throw away instruments of creation they had long used. It would be to sever one's fingers to prevent them from being used for harm. This idea was not without its own cruelty. It would mean losing forever certain songs, certain ways of making things that had begotten beauty and kindness. The debate over whether to amputate art to prevent its use as a weapon was both anguished and necessary. In the end, a compromise, a mixture of surgical erasure and careful hiding, was attempted, but it was partial and imperfect. Records were rewritten, techniques encoded into puzzles and riddles, and a subset of the Old Ones swore to guard those secrets in the silent places. Yet secrets leak. Hunger is a patient student. While these philosophical and practical acts unfolded, wars of a different kind raged in the physical sense. The Necronter and their constructs, brilliant in their inflexible design, assaulted sanctuaries openly now, with a logic that mirrored their ancient despair. They moved like tides in steel, surrounding cities and using networked harmonics to starve the minds of those inside. These sieges were clinical and efficient. Harvest, not massacre. The Old Ones and their allies rallied defenders, but their weapons did not look like the war engines of later, more barbaric eras. An old one might stand in a plaza and tune a lattice until it refused to sing the necronter harmonic. A contingent of guardians might place mirrors and prisms to scatter a directed psychic pattern. The battles were of sound and rhythm, of subtraction and insertion. They were terrifying in a way that a child's hand cannot imagine. The assault on a culture's ability to remember and to be surprised is a violence that leaves no ruins to measure. The climax's cruelest moments were often intimate. There were rooms where parents watched with a heartbreak that made even the old ones sting as their children were taken, not killed, but softened into instruments of compliance. There were shrines where priests read the names of ancestors aloud and found the names returning in crystalline form to the temples as wares to be traded. Artisans, who had once carved new instruments of life, were forced to make lattices that would hold their neighbors in a more useful tune. Loyalty frayed into collaboration. Collaboration frayed sometimes into treachery. Some among the old ones, weary of endless loss, cut quiet bargains that traded small freedoms for the preservation of their kin. Betrayals were not always monstrous. Sometimes they were practical, made by hands that trembled with the thought of a child frozen by hunger. And then, at a point that many later historians would call the fulcrum of ages, the Citan themselves underwent a further catastrophic mutation in their relations. As the pressure of the weave pushed against the Citan, a few of those star voices began to split irrevocably. Where once a Citan had been whole in its incomprehensible appetite, now shards of its consciousness fractured and took on new valences. Some shards became more ravenous, craving direct and immediate consumption of sensation. Others became sly and manipulative, preferring the spread of habit. The breaking of a Citan was a violent cosmic event, not loud in the ordinary sense, but a twisting of the underlying grammar of existence. Fragments fell and were captured, as we have seen, and with their capture, the necronter amassed new powers. They learned to bind Citan pieces into reliquaries that could be triggered to flood a culture with a taste memory that would prompt the desired obedience. This fracturing of gods had an unintended consequence the old ones never hoped for. It made the Citan, in some respects, more human in their divisions. Rivalry among fragments led to infighting, and where gods argued, the cosmos trembled. Such quarrels opened fissures the old ones could exploit, windows that allowed small, painful triumphs. In some theaters, they managed to trap and shatter a fragment so entirely that the residual energy could be dispersed harmlessly. Each such win came with a cost. The energy released burned cities in a slow, uncanny way, leaving populations alive but hollow, with memories intact but the warmth of feeling leached away. Liberations were not always rescues. Sometimes they were amputations that left survivors sterile, with the memory of what had been taken. Near the climax's peak, a decision was made that later ages would call both heroic and tragic. A coalition of old ones, Eldar who had not yet learned the full scope of their culture's later ruin, and the first of human allies devised a desperate gambit to create a counteragent that would neutralize the Citan's appetite in a particular band of frequency. It was not a weapon in the crude sense. It was a biochemical psychic algorithm that would, temporarily, dull the taste of certain emotional cadences the Citan prized. To deploy, it required the insertion of a systemic agent into the airs and waters of targeted worlds. A subtle, gentle fog that would lull the appetite for particular flavors of memory. Once dispersed, the Citan could not feed on those tastes, at least for a generation. The scheme worked in small arcs, but its ethics were bitter. To inoculate a culture was to alter its palate, to choose which feelings would be available to relish and which would be dulled. The old ones, tired and grieving, accepted the trade as surgery, but for many it felt like censorship. In the flaring, final hours of the climax, the webway itself suffered catastrophic trauma. Years of strikes and countermeasures, the hammering away at arteries, the insertion of reliquaries and the removal of harmonics, reached a point where a cascade occurred. Nodes collapsed in sequence, Entire corridors imploded and were cut from the net in a heartbeat. Worlds that had once conversed freely found themselves isolated in a way that made the Old One's earlier decision to fold regions seem both prescient and cruel. Isolation accelerated degradation. Where improvisation had survived in pockets, it could not leap the new chasms. Trade and cross-cultural fertilization, the very forces that had once created resilience and surprise, waned. And then silence swelled in a manner that felt vast. Not total silence, for life continued in countless measures, but a propagated quiet. The Webway's chorus had been diminished like an orchestra losing sections, until the music became thin and echoing. The climax had achieved a terrible balance of outcomes. Some protections had been won, some harvest had been stalled, but the cost was a world made smaller, a galaxy with more margins and fewer whole, open voices. The Old One's countersong had saved much and yet produced new instruments for hunger. Surgical strikes had freed islands but left scars that others could read. The folding of corridors had preserved some lives at the price of 1,000 possible futures. In the aftermath of the climax, the Old Ones were changed. Many had braided themselves into the weave and could no longer wander. They were present as living keystones, humming their protection while mournful in the knowledge that their song could be studied and exploited. Some had sacrificed their memories into the countersong and were dimly present in the Webway's hum, less as individuals than as a tuning fork. Others, who had taken part in surgical strikes or the painful erasures, carried the weight of choices that would haunt their ages. The Eldar carried scars that would later erupt into other tragedies. The Necronter, in triumph and in sorrow, found that immortality had narrowed their aims. The Cetan were fractured, some bound, some dead in ways the Old Ones only understood in notes of agony. And yet amidst the grief, there remained stubborn sparks of the life the Old Ones had loved. Sanctuaries where improvisation held on like wildflowers in a scraped field persisted. Small bands of artisans hid forbidden techniques, teaching apprentices how to make toys that would delight unpredictably. Children invented games that the lattices could not parse. Elders hummed songs whose intervals did not map to any harvest. These things persisted like ticks of a clock kept under the floorboards, quiet, resilient, and dangerous to the hungry. The climax had not burned the possibility of surprise into absolute ash. It had only made survival more difficult and more rare. What the climax ultimately proved, and what the Old Ones would whisper into their fading archives, was a lesson both simple and terrible. Kindness, wielded as a tool without immutable context, can be turned into a market. Rescue can be inverted into a leash. Protection can be studied and repurposed. They learned that some remedies bear seeds that will sprout in forms you cannot predict. They learned that any open melody can be sampled into a dish that feeds a god. And yet they also learned that sacrifice can buy time. Islands of freedom, moments of play, centuries in which improvisation can breathe. Those lessons did not undo the cost. They were, at best, instruments for the next act. So the climax closed not with a perfect resolution, but with a deep, enduring quiet. The Old Ones, their hands tangled in the Webway's skein, let the hum carry what it could of their voices. They watched as the Necronter retreated to their tomb worlds, as the Cetan fragments were bound or shattered, and as countless cultures learned to live within narrower palettes. They mourned, and their mourning was a work of art and ethics both. They left behind songs encrypted in lullabies, puzzles in their oldest libraries that might, they hoped, teach future minds the right kinds of doubt. And in the smallest corners of the galaxy, children kept inventing things that surprised even their inventors. Breathe now, slowly. The climax was the hour of greatest fracture, the turning where the soft incursions became a war that took whole modes of being. It was a moment that echoes down the ages as a caution. The smallest comforts, repeated without question, can become the instruments of the largest cruelties. Yet the climax also left the ember of resistance alive, fragile but real. Hold that ember gently in your palm as you settle deeper. It is the same ember that will bloom into rebellions, into songs that cannot be cataloged, and into the unpredictable joy of a child's new tune. The story does not end here. It continues, folded and worn into the quieter chapters that follow. You said, conclusion, lingering terror, 2,000 words, ChatGPT said. There is a peculiar kind of silence that follows great unravelings, not the empty hush of absence, but a thick, listening quiet that seems to hold its breath because it is afraid of what might wake. The galaxy after the wars and bargains moved like that for long ages. A heavy, watchful hush settled over places that had once hummed with many voices. The webway still sang, but its music was scarred. The chords carried the memory of what had been added and stolen, and the tune learned a new, cautious cadence. In that new cadence, you could hear the old one's countersongs braided with the metallic echo of trophies and reliquaries. And for anyone who sat very still and let the sound wash slowly through them, the harmonies were both comfort and accusation. It is tempting, when telling this last part, to reach for absolutes, monsters and martyrs, clear victories and defeats. The truth is quieter and stranger. The aftermath was lived most often in small gestures rather than proclamations. A grandmother in a folded world might still hum the exact lullaby the old ones had taught her when she expected rain. And in that hum, there would be both the ache of a lost song and the iron knowledge that the tune kept the roof from leaking. A child in a sanctuary might discover a game in which bricks were stacked in impossible ways, and that child's laugh would be a thin, stubborn thing that tasted like sunlight on metal. Lives continued in the uneven, stubborn manner of life anywhere. Repair, play, remembering, forgetting, and the slow accretion of habits that pass for culture. Yet the terror never entirely left. It learned to go quieter. Where once there had been open harvests and overt bargains, there remained traces, small devices humming faintly beneath skin, filaments that glowed at the edges of temples, and reliquaries in which memories had been stored so precisely they could be replayed like music boxes at the bidding of a lord or a god. These things were practical. They did not scream. Their horror was domestic and polite. A neighbor might borrow a reliquary to listen to a father's memory of grain yields, and return it without thought to the fact that in listening they had given a sliver of another's life into the market. The economy of feeling had become currency, and currency tends to change how people treat one another. The old ones themselves remained, though not as omnipotent gardeners. Many had braids woven into the fabric of the webway. They were present as keystones, humming slowly in place, their movement curtailed by the very cords that made the network safe for others. They carried grief like a second skin, not the dramatic grief of shrieking loss, but a long, practical sorrow that measured the distance between intention and outcome. In their quiet, they wrote puzzles into libraries, encoded doubts into lullabies, and left marginalia in ways that were designed to be discovered by those who still asked difficult questions. Their hope was not blind. It was bitter and clever. They wanted future listeners to learn to doubt what came easily. Part of what remained most disturbing was the ease with which people accepted small comforts that cost more than they knew. Comfort is a gentle teacher. It asks very little at first, and then subtly it asks for more. A healed limb became an implant that made life easier. An implant became a lattice that reshaped attention. Attention reshaped a culture. The chain was not sudden. It was arithmetic and accumulative. In the ruined libraries, the old ones noted this pattern with the clinical sadness of archivists watching a manuscript bleed its margins into black stains. You could trace the path from a useful invention to a structural dependency, as one traces a river back to its source. Small streams gathering until the current could no longer be turned. The lingering terror often worked by memory. There were communities whose elders could recite histories with perfect fidelity, yet those histories lacked an interior warmth. They were accurate but empty of the unpredictable anecdotes, the off-key songs, the private jokes that make memory human and messy. In other places, children learned to build perfection into their toys, toys that would never break. And with that perfection went a kind of boredom that settled like dust. It was not always malevolent. Sometimes these changes were simply pragmatic, born of the desire to protect the vulnerable or to steady a world that had known sudden demolition. But pragmatism can calcify into a culture, and calcified cultures can be easy to govern. There were also more direct legacies of horror that could not be soothed by practical arguments. Some reliquaries, once open, revealed the way entire communities had been coaxed into patterns they would not have chosen awake. The crystalline recordings preserved the tone of voices and the contour of feelings, and the curation of those recordings became a new power. Those who controlled the vaults could select which pasts were available as sources of consolation, as objects for study, and as tastes to feed a god. This selective preservation turned history into an instrument. The people whose memories were stored often found themselves reduced to exemplary narratives, their rich lives pruned to fit the menu of the living. That pruning left a hollowness that later generations would feel as a lack of depth. They would know events but not the small, messy human reasons for loving them. And yet, in all this, there were sparks that refused to be cataloged. Improvisation, that most dangerous of human traits, survived in surprising places. It nested in children who had never tasted the reliquaries, in artists forced to work in the margins, and in the hands of those elders who refused to let their songs be smoothed into marketable cadenzas. These small resistances were not military campaigns. They were stubborn attempts to keep surprise alive. A maker who hides a little flaw into a perfectly engineered toy. An old woman who teaches her granddaughter a tune slightly out of phase with the lattice's clock. A group of children who invent a chant that draws no attention from the listening nets. Such acts were foolish and often punished by the pragmatic governments and guardians who preferred stability. But like a root under asphalt, improvisation moved in secret, finding cracks and slipping through. It matters to say this because the lingering terror could be resisted only in forms that refused to be tidy or obvious. The old ones had learned, painfully, late, that weapons and counter-melodies could be studied, repurposed, and turned by those with patient cruelty. The only defenses that remained hard to copy were those that relied on human unpredictability. An artisan's private joke, an idiom that changed each time it was told, a child's game that could not be described without killing its joy. The pockets of rebellion that survived often did so not because they were powerful, but because they were hidden, fluid, and meaningless enough that the hungry could not be sure what they were harvesting. The moral residue of the ages is a constant companion in quiet rooms. Debates that had raged among the old ones, whether to step in, to let go, to amputate, to hide knowledge, became the basis of everyday decisions for later keepers. Guardians who took from the archive sometimes justified their taking by invoking hard-sounding arithmetic. Lives saved, systems stabilized, elders kept warm. But these decisions always carried a shadow in the eyes of those who watched, a suspicion that safety had been purchased with the slow erosion of freedom. The terror that lingered most bitterly was not the immediate threat of death, but the longer, subtler threat of being shaped so completely that one could no longer tell what parts of oneself were chosen and what parts were provided. The old ones, for their part, turned inward in the final centuries of their known presence. Some withdrew into the deepest nodes of the webway, their voices so braided with systems that they could not speak except as part of the net. Others wandered into the hidden places they had once used to store dangerous techniques, guarding them not with commands but with riddles, and with the careful, frustrating habit of making knowledge difficult to borrow. It was a strange form of stewardship, control by obfuscation. To the later races, this would look sometimes like cowardice, sometimes like wisdom. The old ones had learned a new thing, which historians often misread. The refusal to simplify the world is itself a mercy because simplification favors tyrants. There are stories whispered, disputed, and often sentimentalized of small triumphs that lighten the gloom. In some systems, Entire communities managed to reclaim songs from reliquaries, learning how to sing them back with the eccentricities that made them living. In others, artisans built toys that taught hidden rhythms to children, rhythms that would later make those children less susceptible to the harvester's cadences. The acts were rare and localized, but they mattered. They were proof that surprise and resistance were not fully extinguished. The lasting lesson of these ages is not a tidy moral. It is a weary, complicated observation that tenderness without hard boundaries can be learned and used by those with appetite. That gifts, however lovingly given, can be reframed into instruments of control, and that the only certain bulwark against such perversions is the human capacity for unpredictability and for keeping certain joys uncommodified. The Old One's final archive is full of admonishments couched as art, little parables about how to bury your best songs in ways that make them hard to sell, instructions on how to teach children to make mistakes, puzzles intended to make students mistrust easy answers. These are not technological fixes, they are habits of life. They are the sort of small, stubborn choices that a people can make at breakfast time, in the way they teach their children to count and to play. So the terror remains, like a low tide that never quite recedes. It is a companion in rooms with reliquaries and in hands that have been steadied by filaments. It is the thought that the comfortable night may be bought at the price of a slow forgetting, but it is also, necessarily, the stage on which courage can perform its quiet acts. A whispered joke that will not be sold, a deliberately broken toy, a song that refuses to close its final chord. The world after the Old Ones is neither wholly bleak nor wholly bright. It is, like most things that endure trouble, a place of compromise and of stubborn human mischief. If you listen now, in a quiet moment, you may yet catch the Old One's faint advice braided into the webway's hum. Doubt easy comforts. Guard improvisation as one guards water. Teach your children the skill of making mistakes and laughing at them. And when given a choice between a sure life and a life rich with unpredictable small joys, choose the latter often enough that the habit survives. The warning is not a mandate, it is a practice. Breathe slow. Let that practice settle as you close your eyes. Remember that terror is often patient because it works by habit, and that habit can be broken by other, equally patient habits of resistance. Keep a small, private song in your pocket. Teach it to those who will follow you. In the quiet of the webway's wounded music, let that stubborn, messy human tune continue to echo. It is not loud. It is not marketable. It is, perhaps, the only thing the hungry find too difficult to fully consume.